Well, you learn how to travel quietly because you know to raise any ruckus or raise any fuss or I used to get a kick out of watching the purple-faced fellows whose flight had been canceled standing at the airline ticket counter beating up a clerk that had nothing to do with it. I didn't have the energy to waste on that sort of thing, so I learned to be very quiet and very invisible. And the least perturbance or break in the water that you made, the better off you were because you got through the day easier. So I never went for a big splash. When I'd go out to eat, it was just very quiet in a corner booth. And I didn't like notoriety or any of the extras. I traveled an awful lot in my work. I worked in a lot of, just every kind of company there is. I worked in manufacturing companies, in service companies, in hotels. I worked in hospitals. I worked in universities, schools, and I worked at just a full spectrum of situations, which was exciting and fun. One day I'd be working in a hospital and working with professionals and nurses. The next day I'd be in a coal mine in Kentucky, or Pennsylvania, and it was really neat from that standpoint. But as far as my travels and work, it was a heavy travel schedule. The work, I didn't see anything beyond my work or much beyond my work when I worked because it was the office and a restaurant to get something to eat and a hotel room, and that's all I saw. And there were many times I woke up in the morning not remembering where I was, and I had to look at the telephone at the bedside and see the area code to try to remember where I was, just in waking up. But so the traveling, really wears on you. I think the work that I did in England was probably the most fascinating. And that was mainly because the English people don't seem to work as hard as Americans do. I hope I don't get in trouble by saying that, but it's true. And so when I'd go over there, it would always be more than a week's work because it's not worth going there for just a week. The cost. So I had weekends in London on my own, and that was fascinating. I traveled around London and a little bit outside of London and saw some of the countryside and saw an awful lot of London proper. Could have spent a lot more time in London. I liked London, and I learned this. I got to know the city, got to know my way around. Didn't spend a whole lot of time there before I just got away from taxi cabs because they were too expensive, and I took the tubes everywhere I went. There's subway system. I've never ridden the subway in New York City. I wouldn't know what to do down there, but in London I can go anywhere you want, and so it was fun there. I learned a lot. It was interesting. I've often said I could live in London. It's probably the most civilized city I ever saw, and it's neat. I worked with a publishing or a publisher that owned several publishing companies, and they predominantly published scholarly works. And their main market or customer was a university or a library that would bought their stuff. And they published an awful lot of medical journals and those sorts of things. So the people I worked with there were very erudite. The head of the one of the medical journals there that I worked with a lot was Dr. Barsky, who was a I think he was an expert in botany by education, and had taught at the university level. But then he became an editor, and pretty soon he was the manager of the whole section, the whole operation, that part of the business. So they were interesting people. The managing director of the firm or the operations in London was a historian by education, and very English, and brought up in the most proper way, and went to the proper schools in Cambridge, and went off and served in the Queen's Army in India, as he should properly, and came back. And at the time I was working with him, he was working on the Codex, which was Leonardo da Vinci's drawings and collection of scientific studies that's housed at Windsor Castle. And so he was working with the Queen's liaison to go into Windsor Castle and photograph these Codex drawings, mainly of Da Vinci's, and they published just a giant of a work for that. It was monumental and terribly expensive, and a few museums and some libraries were the only ones that could buy it. They were the only ones who could afford it. So, but it was a heck of a work. That was his specialty. So.